would be breaking down these paradigmatic instances. Any education, any educator, any institution can use this in this way. And we can fill these in with all types of sensory experiences to solve problems in between. Every instance is going to change, but that's the wicked story.
Absolutely.
That's the wicked framework.
That is the wicked framework.
That's the wicked framework.
Fucking love it. So the aspiration inspiration thing is good. I love it.
So I'll start one more time.
Yeah.
So the meta story is that learning is a false dichotomy between having to be something or having to acquire something. So in the US market, I have to acquire this to become someone good in business. In the Indian market, it's more about you are going to become something. It's a vocationally driven thing, right?
Exactly.
So essentially, when we get into the aspirational levers, it's a rational viewpoint in the US, but more of an emotional one in India, right? Because you're being force-fed certain elements. What drives these? Sociocultural aspects, technological aspects, economic aspects, environmental, and political. Now, we won't break all of those down right now, but what happens is we get into archetype definition, which goes into different causes and nuances. So we break down, for instance, how learning is processed in India versus how learning is done in the US. In India, as you described, the learning process happens between the parent and the teacher. That is the paradigm that exists now. I'm not saying it's the right one, it's the one that exists. In the US, learning actually happens between students because there's a disconnect between teachers and students to begin with. There's separation. So what we want to do, of course, is bridge those gaps in every instance. Now, what happens is, when we get into Vedic learning, which we have identified as the primary driver, a solution set for a sensorial, experiential solution to any instance, we have different nuances there. So in one case, we can use sound or pattern recognition, which would likely happen in an Indian classroom just because of the way things are set up. And in the US classroom, it's more around sound interpretation. We can blow this out, right?
This is brilliant, yeah.
Into more instances.
And it's about behavioural patterns at this stage. It's all about that. Yeah.
Exactly right. So
and
now,
remember about the archetypes. The archetype.
I'll get to that in a second. So then what happens is the narrative builds, the situation builds, we start to see different solutions for an experience using technology or methodology or circumstance or whatever, right? The archetypal roles change over time. We play different roles. That's where the gameplay dynamic enters the question. And where we net out is a sensorial experience that solves one instance of a problem, but can inform the next problem coming in. And the meta conclusion is that education must be sensorial overall. Without sensation, we have nothing. And it makes sense because it's either binary, it's either mathematical or it's linguistic, and both have thresholds to them. In fact, context around learning through language is greatly challenged, not just by language barriers, but the context of the words themselves.
Absolutely.
For one example.
And just to tie that back into the theme at the front, the meta story that you've set up, is that if learning is a disconnect, a false dichotomy between those two things, we start with the fact that the way the education system is set up, it's set up with aspirational levers.
Correct.
But our conclusion
Yeah.
is that we need to move to a system of inspirational levers.
Thank you. Thank you for writing that.
And that is what's key.
Can you please write that down immediately?
Don't lose it, don't lose it.
I love that. We're going from aspirational levers to inspirational levers.
And we have this amazing arch over the story architecture that we had built before.
No,
which all
totally.
fits
And here's the radical part, which we'll fill out a little bit and not kill ourselves, is that we have our meta story. So now the stuff that we fill in actually has its own narrative pieces, which are simple. They don't have to be complicated.
Absolutely.
That involve antagonist, protagonist levers, role of archetype, how they change, and then how do we get to a desired result. And any classroom or any teacher can use that. It's like a filter. It's like running it through a filter.
Cool. I'm going to high five.
All right, good job.
All right.
So,